resiliency and security is actually a culture issue. It's not a technology issue. So I think the best thing that any company can do is how do you build a culture of security?
Hello, everybody. My name is Khalid Kark, and I'm here joined today by Jeff Gatz, who is the VP of Global Alliances at Kyndryl. Welcome, Jeff, to our conversation.
Thank you.
Our conversation today is called Resilience Reimagined. Of course, a lot of people have experiencing the issues with third parties that they've got for a long time. Compliance landscape is changing pretty rapidly. And then recently, geopolitical aspects are also changing pretty rapidly. So, of course, resilience needs to be not rethought, reimagined as we speak. So one of the things that we kind of put out, we put out the Signals report that talks about major shifts that are happening in cybersecurity that C-suite executives need to worry about. And one of the things we pointed out was resilience as a concept needs to be rethought a little bit. So let's start, let's jump in and kind of get your perspective on how do you think the threat landscape is changing specifically with respect to organizations thinking about resilience?
Well, it's interesting. So we're all reimagining it in real time, as it were,
Absolutely.
Just with the rapid pace of change. And I think when you look at resiliency as a topic, a lot of times what you're thinking of is really sort of your backup and recovery, your DRAS type of partners, right? Commvault, your Rubrics, we really like those. But that's just one very small aspect of the concept of resiliency. And what you're really looking for is resiliency throughout sort of the full 7-layer stack. But then in the partners that you choose, and partners that Kyndryl chooses to go to market with, where do we have trust in supply chain, front of house, back of house, right? And if we think of the IT infrastructure and architecture. And what that really comes down to is resiliency in policy, resiliency in connectivity. And because what are you really solving for? So at Kyndryl, we like to think about minimum viable company in terms of resiliency, right? What does that really mean? It means that when you have, and hopefully you don't, but we believe it's when you have that catastrophic event, whether that's malware, whether that's a nation state, whatever that happens to be, what is your minimum viable set of applications? And that is for the external and internal users to protect your services, to protect your brand, and to protect your C-suite. And so from a recovery perspective, you have to look at the full continuum of infrastructure in order to do that, which does require a complete reimagining. It can't just be how fast is my snapshot? What's my RPO, RTO, right? Those things are, yes, those are table stakes, but how do you bring the whole thing back up? And I think the best and easiest example is, okay, you switched over to your backup data center. How do you re-IP? How do you re-ARP? How do you re-DNS everything so the clients and the users can get to those applications, which is functionally your brand externally?
Sure. And we just had a conversation earlier around AI impacting cybersecurity. So yeah, I know it's a whole can of worms to kind of jump into,
Right.
But how does that change? You've kind of laid out the whole spectrum of what resiliency is.
Mm-hmm.
Does that change anything in that spectrum, or does that change the way we deal with that spectrum from your perspective?
So yes and yes. One of my personal good friends over at the SANS Institute likes to talk about AI as a double-edged sword. So I'm very much borrowing from him in that statement. But as we look at AI, it becomes both the weapon and also the defense against what's happening out there. And I think the major change that we're going to see is the evolution of agentic AI. If you think about the attack patterns, if you think about the surfaces that are under threat, right? Most of those have been, there's a human, even if it's a human with a script, really kicking off those attack patterns.
Sometimes not a human either.
Well, that's where the agentic AI gets really scary for me personally, right? As just a user in the world, right? Now we have autonomous systems that are, just the sophistication of those attacks without getting into the deep conversation, which is 3 days long. But the sophistication of those attacks and the evolution of those attacks are where resiliency needs to be designed in. And so if you think of, like the workers that Cloudflare has as part of that, how do you help that scale, and how can Gen AI or agentic AI be the response to that within the policies in order to protect it? And I think that really is the double-edged sword. AI is only good as the model and only as good as you've trained it. right? And so how do we come together as an industry to respond to those threats that are rapidly evolving?
One of the things that a lot of companies worry about is how, I mean, of course, and we've got an increasing ecosystem of partners, whether they're AI or cybersecurity or other technology partners and so on. And third-party risks have increased significantly, recently a lot more as well. Any thoughts, any perspectives on how companies deal with things outside of their organizations? Are you seeing companies think about resiliency in the broader context of their ecosystems, and how is that evolving from your perspective?
Very much so. And I think that goes to some of the macro political issues that we're dealing with these days. But I think supply chain trust is probably that core element that you're talking about there. So, one of the things that we do as Kyndryl, and we're certainly not unique in this, but one of the things that we do is we make sure that we do that verification and that we have API hooks into those supply chains so we can verify. And some of that can be as very simple as, can I deliver the products on time? And some of it is, do we have sort of that all the way back end flow through? Is that coming from a trusted source, right? Was there an interruption in that source where maybe a bad actor inserted something into that supply chain? Gray market is definitely a concern. Customers are always looking to, save costs. Gray market's not the way to do that. So that supply chain verification, and that is a huge part of resiliency, because if your resiliency go to market, if you will, is based upon trust, and you're not verifying all the way back to the manufacturer, and that, again, very deep in the supply chain, then the whole thing can fall apart.
Yeah, World Economic Forum came up and they asked people, what is your number one risk? And third-party risk was number one for 54%. And so to your point, that supply chain risk is, as we become entities that are much more intertwined than we were in the past, becomes a big part of the resiliency conversation. So let's maybe move on to industries, organizations, how they're changing as a response to resilience, and kind of what are some effective maybe operating models, or how are companies thinking about responding to this increased threat vector, the increased supply chain kind of risks, increased geopolitical risks, et cetera. How do companies respond to some of these risks, and what are they doing, if anything, different?
Yeah. Well, resiliency and security is actually a culture issue. It's not a technology issue,
Sure.
right? Technology is an enabler there. So as we look at that culture shift, you really have to have everybody really moving. So you have to have the tools in place to do it. You have to have the policy, and then you have to make sure that that human element of it, that everybody's on board from a culture perspective, and that they understand it. I think, one of the things we as people, we all get really irritated when somebody says "thou shalt," and they don't give us a reason why, right? Why do we have to go do it? And so if we look at the regulated industries, the easy way to say it, but certainly I've dealt with those, some of our customers in finance and in healthcare, where they do a really great job of the training, right? So they talk about the architecture, what are the controls they're putting in place, right? And they say, hey, this update's coming out. Here's why this is important, right? So why are we going to go passwordless? Or what does two-factor look like for us? Here are the policies in place. Here's what we're monitoring on your system, and here's why. So you've got to build that buy-in to make that happen, or else that human element, again, it takes one chink in the armor, as we've all seen with ransomware, right, to cause that problem. So I think the best thing that any company can do, and certainly what we consult on with our customers, is how do you build a culture of security, right, that's self-sustaining? And you need, again, the tools, the process, the technology, and the people to all buy in. The good ones have done that, though there are still a lot that are still working through it.
One thought, I was talking to a CISO, and he said something interesting. Love to get your perspective on it, because you have a pretty broad view across some of the vendors in this landscape as well. And he said that one of the things that I look for is, where can I actually take out the human element as much as possible from this, where I don't have to train somebody to respond to a certain thing. I just take out that threat vector through technology, right? And so are companies thinking about it that way, where you say, well, we all know phishing has been the biggest bane in everybody's existence, because irrespective of whatever training you do, 1 out of 10 people is still going to fall for it in some way, shape, or form. Right?
Sure.
And so how do you actually, as an ecosystem, how do we as companies think about this in terms of how do we eliminate those human error capabilities? And are you seeing any progress in that respect?
So we're always seeing progress. And I think the efficacy, if you just look at mail security, right? The efficacy of mail security is upwards, I think, of 98, 99% based on the various solutions that are out there, whether that's Microsoft or Cisco or whoever, right? In terms of the mail security. But again, that answer wasn't 100%, right?
Exactly.
And the attackers are very sophisticated. So yes, we're absolutely seeing that. We want to reduce the risk as much as possible. And we're going to leverage technology to do that. But I think it goes back to one of my all-time favorite phrases, and that's trust but verify, right? So you can implement the best technology in the world, and maybe someday we get to 100%, and I can't wait for that. And maybe Gen AI and agentic AI can help us keep checking that mark, right? But we're always going to have that full continuum. So yes, we see it. We want to remove the threat vectors. I completely agree with that, CISO. But we also know that nothing is 100% foolproof because the adversaries in this space are always, they're sharp.
Well, I mean, I agree. But I think as companies, we also need to start to rethink cybersecurity, because whatever we've been doing, we're still having people fall for it, right? And
100%.
so maybe AI and ML can help us. Maybe maybe we come up with models where we're able to predict certain types of phishing or certain types of risks, supply chain risks are addressed before they actually get to the people side of things and the end users.
You know, there's a couple elements. I think, as you know, we've been talking about Gen AI for a few years, right? And especially as it comes to security, it's been a really hot topic for the last 12 months. But we are still nascent relative to the Gen AI evolution, right? So 3 years from now, we probably have a hard time really predicting what that looks like. And so I think you're absolutely right. There are evolutions, not just revolutions, that are going to happen, right? Or evolutions and revolutions that will happen as Gen AI continues to mature, as we understand how to protect it. But, you know, you look at those language models and we can look at, you know, sandwich attacks and poisoning of the language model that occur, right? So I think it's always a balance. Technology is a great tool, but it requires the mastery that we have as IT practitioners and security practitioners to ensure that our customers are there. So, and they're taking advantage of it. I think that's maybe the other element of it is, of course, we can come out with the greatest technology solution ever. And if they don't turn that on and they don't tie it into their operational model and they don't do those pieces to really make it effective, it's there, but it's not doing the job we intended it to do. And that's our job as a global systems integrator and managed service provider to go do that. And we love partnering with, you know, Cloudflare to make those things happen. But the customer also has to buy in with both of us.
Yeah, and I think absolutely right. And I think we've tried to, in Cloudflare, tried to make it seamless, where a lot of these threat vectors through ML, through other capabilities that are addressed before they get to your networks, to your environments, et cetera. So, but I think that mindset needs to start to evolve for us to shift as an industry from individual threat protection to collective, maybe network protection.
Totally agree. And this is what I love about really our partnership with Cloudflare, right? As we look at the traditional back of the house infrastructure providers, right? And you guys are bringing that to really, again, that policy is built into your infrastructure, right? So you look at all of your points of presence that you have across the globe, how they scale, how they respond, your ability to do fast switching between sites for reliability. And if you think about it, reliability and availability are huge parts of security, right? That policy consistency, connectivity consistency, right? And so that becomes a really important point of the architecture and solution to our customers. And you guys approach it differently than others do. And that is such a powerful tool.
Two topics that we haven't touched on.
Okay.
One is compliance, right?
Oh. I'm sorry, where's the door? Are we done yet? Yeah.
So you know, things are changing there too. And Deloitte had this survey where they said 62% of companies are saying they're going to significantly increase their investments in autonomous compliance. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing there? Is that
so? I couldn't agree more.
That's
so
real?
Compliance, so HIPAA, DORA, GDPR, right? You know, again, those laws are entrenched, and they're really important for the nations or economic zones that they're a part of, right? And obviously, we look at just personal data for us. Yeah, we want to make sure that's protected and secured. But as this has evolved and these policies are overlapping from a compliance perspective, audits and compliance resiliency, I actually think needs to be baked into the architecture and needs to be part of the fundamental set of tools. And I joked earlier because I, used to be actually, fingers on keyboard guy, and the audit people would come around and I'd develop a cold real quick and be like, I can't come in. Never really got out of the job, but still had to prove that, we were compliant.
Yeah. Yes.
But we have to have an automated way of looking across all these great technologies that we use, how the users are implementing them, what the external factors are, and make sure that we're actually compliant. It has to be real time. You think about scope creep and the amoeba-like effect of, I brought this tool in, it did this, now it does these other three things, how it grows. No person can reasonably keep their arms around the rapid evolution of technology as it relates to compliance and making sure that's auditable.
Yeah.
So for us, those hooks into your tools via API, driving that into the broader security suite conversation is a table stakes conversation. But you're right, customers are just now getting on board for that. Because, audit people love to make sure that everything's buttoned up. So you have to audit the audit in order to get there. So it's a really important motion that we're going through with our customers. And we expect that, especially with Gen AI, to evolve rapidly.
Yeah. And I think the one aspect that kind of adds to the complexity of all that is we are predicting and seeing this happen is there's going to be an explosion of compliance requirements being thrown at companies. And there's no way to do it manually one by one.
No.
And so you can't do it by region. You have to have automation there to be able to really live going forward. Otherwise, you're going to be buried in dealing with a lot of that.
Agreed.
So the second is investments. And of course, long are the days gone where you walked in and the board gave you whatever you wanted, et cetera. CISOs are being asked more and more around what is the value of these investments that we're making in resiliency, right? And so any thoughts on how that is evolving for your clients, for the marketplace in general? And then I had a specific question, maybe it gives you kind of 5 seconds to think about it. Where would you tell companies to invest in compliance if they were looking at the spectrum of opportunities that they have today? If they had to invest in one or two areas, what would they be?
So let me answer your first question, which I think will dovetail nicely into the second one. So I think what we're seeing from an investment perspective, security is top of mind. Any of those events can end your company. So they're not optional investments. But in saying that, what we're seeing is consolidation. And what I mean by that is we're seeing more, and Kyndryl certainly went down this journey. There's a lot of great companies out there, but this sort of best of breed, I'll use 700 different vendors to solve 3 problems by integrating together. The technology partners we have like Cloudflare have become so advanced and check so many boxes. What we're looking for is what are our trusted technology partners and how do we leverage the most of their ecosystem, right? That allows us to centralize our spend. It allows us to keep fragmentation from happening. And it also allows us to train fewer people on more skills, right? So deeply integrated, right? So, because if you think about the cost, it's still not licensing, it's still not infrastructure, it is the people cost to manage it. Those people are incredibly talented. We need them to be as deeper in those solutions to drive more value out of them. So that's certainly part of it. It is a balance between some of the tech debt that we certainly see today that's still a very real thing. And then how do we modernize that tech debt? Networking as part of Gen AI and as part of, still coming out of COVID and some of the tech debt that's there. Networking's exciting again. Lots of innovations in this space, lots of things happening with the hyperscalers from a connectivity, SaaS, PaaS, IaaS perspective. And so really that hybrid cloud mentality of connectivity needs to be upgraded, right? So what we see is happening as part of that conversation is never think of networking and security as 2 separate things. They're the 2 things that touch everything, right? So that is the place to do it. So stop putting them in 2 separate buckets, consolidate those requests for investment. I think is the nicest way to say it to the board members, and really get more bang for your buck. So that's kind of where we see it.
I think I wouldn't agree with you more. I think the notion of networks and security being separate I mean, if you're still doing it, you're probably creating a huge risk for your environment doing it that way.
And I think if somebody were to ask me a very humble opinion of where do you invest, you probably invested in a lot of platforms the last 5 to 6 years. And, in that tech debt that you have, and I don't mean that in a negative way, great companies probably solve the problem. I really think a consulting engagement to look at, Kyndryl looks at it as kind of a subway roadmap, right? You got 1,000 different stops you could be on. Which boxes have you checked? Which ones you haven't?
Yep.
But what are those 2 or 3 things based on what you've solved for and what you need to solve for are going to give you a complete view, right? Are you still just in the secure services edge motion? Are you looking at SASE as an outcome? Is it more about compliance and auditability, right? There are very specific things you can do that aren't heavy investments, right? That can really move the needle from a threat landscape perspective for you. But you need to know kind of where you're at, and then what have you invested in that you're not getting the most out of? What investments have you made that maybe aren't getting the ROI that you should stop making? And then consolidating that and then picking those 1 or 2 projects. And again, that's why the security practitioners are so important, as they understand what's latest, what's happening, and how can you really move the needle.
So in other words, what you're saying is prioritize and make sure that you're aware of your risk appetite, because that prioritization is going to come from that. And sometimes a consulting engagement may help. Sometimes just internally thinking about it may come up with an answer. But I think you're right. Also, the fact that a lot of times we end up using outside perspectives to think about this, as a lot of us are too deep into it, where it's hard to figure out the prioritization, and really thinking broadly across what risks are you able to respond to and which ones are not.
Yeah, and I don't want to name names here, right? Because that would be bad. But we have had some engagements recently where we've looked at several different vendors. Who's the trusted technology partners? Who are they looking at internally? And they were asking about bringing a new one in, and we just sort of raised our hand and said, "You are aware that the product you already bought does that, and you already have the license for it." And it was news to them, and we were like, "Okay." So I'm really sorry to tell you that. And then, you sort of got the company looking at each other, right? So there's kind of both of those. And I think that's where those outside perspectives, working closely with, a GSI, hopefully it's Kyndryl and it's, with Cloudflare, but working closely with us, where we have those deep partnerships, where we understand what they have today and what's on the roadmap, and how can we start solving for it with a smaller ecosystem that's still best of breed, but you're actually able to check more boxes. And again, that consistency by consolidating your vendors is just really critical in the security space.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd say is everybody calls themselves a platform. Make sure that you check they're actually a platform. Right? So,
this whole, hey, we're all a platform. I'm like, are you? Yeah, no, I totally agree. Right. It's a huge piece, and we understand the move to that. And customers are still going to ultimately balance. They don't want to have all their eggs in one basket. So there's going to be multiple partners in there, as there should be. But I think you can get more with doing less. So we like to think of it as focus in Kyndryl, right? And what we love is that in our partnership with you guys, you're part of that focus group.
Got it. Last question, and then we'll move to rapid fire.
Sure.
So where do you see this all going next? And again, of course, we all tend to kind of talk about projections and so on. Nobody can really predict more than 12 to 18 months. So maybe let's kind of narrow down future to that 12 to 18 months. Where do you see resiliency is moving? Any specific trajectories or trends that you're seeing from that perspective?
I think it really comes on the infrastructure side of the house, because we're certainly seeing a lot of customers investing in the data center infrastructure. And that's really important. And we see that as, sort of a balancing with our hyperscaler partners. We know that the hyperscalers are critical to the business outcomes, but we also see, especially with Gen AI, with the amount of data that's being stored in the highly regulated environments, we're seeing an upgrade there. And so we expect that that's going to drive some of the secondary behavior around the connectivity and the security policies at the edge. So I think as we look at the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to continue to see investment and reinvestment into data centers. And then our job is to make sure that we don't treat that as a single thing. And what I like to always tell our teams is, if you've touched the application, you've touched the traffic patterns, which means you've touched the WAN. So do it all, right? So you've got to touch it all, even if it's a long-term plan for the customer. So that's where we see those investments happening. And certainly, again, we still have all of the software players in this space. We have to secure those as well. But from my standpoint, we think that infrastructure investment is going to be critical.
And you think that infrastructure investment is going to be in data centers or in the cloud or a combination?
It's going to be both.
Okay.
It's going to be both. Okay. We think about just the way that Google, Microsoft, and AWS move the market, the trust they have with our customers. Certainly what we're doing sees that, but we're seeing in finance and healthcare, again, a balancing. Right? It's just a balancing. So we believe hybrid cloud is the way forward. And again, for every customer, that might be a different mix. But pure in the cloud customers are certainly going to be out there. So it's never black and white, ones and zeros. But for us and our customer base, hybrid cloud is absolutely where we see it.
Got it. All right. Ready for rapid fire?
Let's go.
All right. If you had to describe the current state of cybersecurity, what one word, you've got one word, you're going to use to describe that?
I'm going to go with evolving.
Evolving. Okay, great. Yeah, that's never going to stop.
Nope. That's a safe answer.
Okay. What's the one buzzword in security or tech that you wish we could retire?
Gen AI.
Gen AI. Okay. All right. Already at the beginning of where we are. Okay. What is the biggest obstacle in managing risks today? And I have a couple of options, but you can pick your own. Complacency, scale, complexity, or something else?
It's complexity. I had complexity in my head before you read the list.
Okay, great.
Yep.
In 5 years, corporate leaders will need to be fluent in
quantum.
Quantum, that's the one. Actually, they should be fluent in it now.
They definitely
a lot of
should
cyber
be.
Leaders should be fluent in it now.
So
and yes,
Q-Day is coming, but 5 years as a science experiment will not be a thing. I know this is rapid fire, but that's a whole good conversation.
Fair enough. What's one book, podcast, or show that's surprisingly relevant to how you think about cybersecurity or leadership?
So I'm going to go a little bit old school, right?
Go ahead.
This is going to be a long one. So I was just talking about this the other day, but it's the book Born to Run.
Okay.
Which doesn't make a lot of sense, but it talks about the biomechanics that we were born to run, right? So that's who we are. We have to find the natural state of doing this. It can't always be pushing water up a hill, right? It has to be part of our natural movement within IT.
That is a really, really good advice for a lot of IT leaders.
Yep.
is to figure out ways to sustain yourself for the long term. So completely agree. Thank you. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. And we have a series of these conversations coming up. We have the next one is the perimeter problem, where there's no perimeter anymore. So of course it's a problem. And then we've got Resilience Reimagined that we just talked about. In our post-quantum, the quantum conversation, we have a conversation on that, and then agile security. So we kind of worked on these big issues that not just the cyber people, but also the C-suite executives need to know about and think about collectively. So again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your presence, and it was a fun conversation.
Appreciate you. Thanks for the partnership, and I look forward to listening to those other ones.
Thank you.